So self-diagnosing with ADHD can be massively controversial. There seems to be no in-between when it comes to self-diagnosing. People have one extreme view or another extreme view and nothing in between. So as an ADHD coach, you get a lot of messages about self-diagnosing and whether it's valid or not. So in this video, I want to break down what self-diagnosing is, what it isn't, and what are the ins and outs of self-diagnosing. And I want to be very, very upfront with this. Whichever side of the fence that you fall on, there's going to be things in this video that you agree with, and there's going to be things in this video that you disagree with. But I want you to keep watching and keep an open mind about all aspects of the idea of self-diagnosing. So with that being said, let's jump in. If you're new here, my name's Chris, and I'm a creator with ADHD. And I help fellow active brains learn the tools to finally focus, grow, and get shit done. So self-diagnosis is a massively controversial topic, and you're going to get a million different views from every single side of the spectrum. There is one side of the argument that says that you should only get a medical diagnosis with ADHD, and there's the other side of the argument that says diagnosing yourself is valid and that's all that really matters. It's controversial because despite ADHD being a neurodevelopmental disorder, officially, there are numerous elements that factor into the idea of a diagnosis. So it's not simply a matter of yes or no. One of the misconceptions is that people think that self-diagnosis is simply watching a couple of TikTok videos or YouTube videos and then telling everyone that you have ADHD. In my experience, that is rarely the case. The people who do self-diagnose with ADHD often do a lot of research, a lot of digging, a lot of self-reflection. They may start the tip of the iceberg with recognizing some ideas or experiences on TikTok, but 99% of the time when people self-diagnose, they usually go and fully research and look into the experiences and symptoms that they recognize within themselves before they self-diagnose. A lot of the critics of self-diagnosis think that people simply get an idea in their head and then just tell everyone that they have ADHD. And in my experience, that's just not the case. However, there are always exceptions, I'm certain of it. So what are the realities of self-diagnosis? The reality is that a lot of people start their diagnosis journey of ADHD by recognizing some of the popular TikToks, YouTubes, Twitter threads, etc. And they recognize those things within themselves. So oftentimes people start in the same place, whether they get an official diagnosis or not. Although there can be a lot of misinformation out there about ADHD, and there's the possibility of misdiagnosing yourself with a neurodevelopmental disorder, the reality is that a lot of people start their journey by recognizing the certain symptoms or comorbidities that come with it before they continue on that journey and start to develop that knowledge and that research on ADHD as a whole. The truth is, there are a lot of self-assessments out there that are quite reliable and quite accurate, and no diagnosis, whether it's professional or whether it's self-diagnosis, is going to be 100% accurate. Of course, there exists misdiagnoses, and there are stories of people who have been diagnosed initially with ADHD that actually turned out to be something different, or people who have been diagnosed with anxiety or BPD that actually turns out to be ADHD. So there's not one diagnosis that is 100% reliable. But most of the time when people self-diagnose, they usually take the multiple reasonably reliable self-assessments and then combine it with their own experience and the shared experience of other people in order to come to a conclusion within themselves. So why would you not just get a professional diagnosis? The reality is that when it comes to healthcare and healthcare systems, it's very dependent on where you live and the quality of healthcare and the price of healthcare that you get. So when it comes to public healthcare, which is government funded, often in countries of the world where that's prevalent, there are very long waiting lists because mental health is not usually prioritized, if at all. So there can be very, very long waiting lists for an official diagnosis, which can lead to delayed treatment. On the opposite end of the scale, where healthcare, for example, like the United States, is paid for, oftentimes a diagnosis can be prohibitively expensive. It can be thousands and thousands of dollars. And if you are low income or on a tight budget, then spending thousands and thousands of dollars on an ADHD diagnosis is not necessarily top priority. And historically, it has been changing in recent years, but a lot of the preliminary research in ADHD has been into children and often males specifically. When you do pursue a diagnosis, then you can fall through the cracks in the current system that's available. And one of the other reasons why you may not want to pursue a medical diagnosis is that for a large group of people, there is a backlash against calling it a disorder or a deficit and pathologizing it. And that group of people believes that it's not accurate to call it a disorder. It's simply the way our brain works. And it's just one of a range of brains that sort of appear on a bell curve, right? And our brain is somewhere over here. So ADHD is simply part of the spectrum of brains. So the idea of pathologizing it and calling it something that needs to be fixed or cured is inaccurate. So the question is, can you self-diagnose? As with most things, the answer is complicated. There are simply pros and cons of self-diagnosis. As an ADHD coach and not as a medical professional, but in my personal opinion, you can self-diagnose, but it needs to be preceded with a lot of caution. So when it comes to mental health in general, I would always advise where you can to seek the help of a mental health professional. Because even if you do believe that you have something such as ADHD, I personally think that it's very, very important to seek out a confirmation where you can from somebody who's qualified to look at everything within context with a professional lens. So with that being said, I want to jump into the pros and the cons. So let me know in the comments below, have you self-diagnosed with ADHD, or do you fall on the other side of the fence where you think that a medical diagnosis of ADHD is the only way to go? I want to hear from you. So I want to preface this by just pointing out that I know that a lot of people are going to want to jump into this and look straight at the pros, but I want you to take this as a whole. I want you to look at the pros and the cons of it, because nothing is 100% straightforward. Despite whatever decision you make, it's important to take in the whole rather than simply skipping over the things that you don't necessarily want to hear. With that being said, I'm going to jump into the cons. So the first con of self-diagnosis is having confirmation bias. If you self-diagnose, you could focus on symptoms that simply validate your self-diagnosis and overlook possible other causes or conditions. So as human beings, we can seek out things that prove us right. When we get ideas in our minds, oftentimes we look for the things that support that idea already and can reject a lot of the things that work against it. Which is why I said to take into account the pros and the cons, because oftentimes we can simply look for the things that support our ideas that we have in our minds already. So it's important to recognize that as human beings, we have a lot of confirmation bias to the things that we already believe. So it's important to look out for that. One con of self-diagnosis is that self-diagnosis lacks the confirmation of a medical evaluation. You don't get the comprehensive tests and the professional interpretations. Having a third party to objectively see what box you fit into necessarily, or boxes or categories your brain fits into, is actually really helpful, because you can receive more specialized care if you do get a professional diagnosis, which is an objective point of view. Another con of self-diagnosis is that without a formal diagnosis, it can be challenging to get prescribed medications or specialized treatment plans that could be really beneficial. Without that medical diagnosis, that piece of paper to say officially that you have ADHD, it can be really difficult to get the medication, but also specialized treatment plans such as therapy, they can be sometimes subsidized. It can be challenging if you are just self-diagnosing. Another con is there can be inadequate solutions. The coping strategies that you implement from your self-diagnosis may not be effective, or could even be harmful in some cases if your self-diagnosis is incorrect. So if you've self-diagnosed yourself with ADHD and you don't have ADHD, then the things that you're trying out for yourself can be ineffective. Unfortunately, self-diagnosis can have a real stigma to it. People can look down on it, they can see it as not valid. Medical professionals particularly have a higher likelihood of carrying that sort of stigma, because what they're doing is they're training for years in order to help diagnose these neurodevelopmental conditions, and what you're doing is skipping over all of the years of research and qualifications that they've gone through and saying that you can basically do it just as well as them by yourself. So that can have a stigma, and that can have an impact on the way some people can perceive you. With self-diagnosis, there can be potential for misinformation. The internet is super resourceful, but it's also full of misinformation. This is no longer the information superhighway. It is chock full of falsehoods, of well-meaning advice that is simply wrong or inaccurate, and you can end up following some bad advice. It could also lead to you wasting money. If you buy ADHD specific resources or tools based on your own self-diagnosis, then you might actually be wasting your money if your diagnosis turns out to be not ADHD related. So ADHD can be frustrating. We can feel lost and like we're not living up to our potential. I get a lot of messages asking how to build a better life with ADHD and accomplish goals, grow relationships, and master our ultra normal brain. And that's why I created the ADHD Blueprint, which is an ADHD coaching program with tools, strategies, and coaching from myself. It covers everything from focus to organization to emotions, ADHD relationships, and ADHD communication. You'll also be part of our growing community of fellow ambitious ADHDers. Don't just survive with ADHD. Start to live up to your potential and craft the thriving life that you deserve. Click the link in the description below to join and take the next step. So as an ADHD myself, I actually started my journey with self-diagnosing before I sought out an official diagnosis. So I've seen the full gamut of the diagnosing journey. So what are the pros of self-diagnosing with ADHD? The first one off is awareness. It brings awareness to an issue that you may not have recognized yourself. It helps you to better understand your own behaviors and your own struggles. This is the very start of my journey, is that I started to do my research once I'd heard about this thing called ADHD, and I did my research and I self-diagnosed internally before I actually sought out that official diagnosis, and helping me to recognize the way that I tick, the way that I learn things, the way that I do things, and understand more my brain and the challenges that I face. And I've seen this a lot with the members on the ADHD Blueprint program that I run, that the more we understand the challenges that we face, the more that we're able to work with our brain in order to overcome them. Another pro of self-diagnosis is that it can serve as a stepping stone to getting the professional help and can be a catalyst for seeking a formal diagnosis. It doesn't have to be one or the other. Self-diagnosis can simply be a stepping stone on the way to getting a formal diagnosis, if that's something that you choose. Another pro of self-diagnosis is that for those without immediate access to healthcare, like we mentioned earlier on, so whether it's money or whether it's waiting lists or anything in between, self-diagnosis can offer some initial guidance. It can actually help to start to open up the toolbox for us to understand our brain and to start working with it. Self-diagnosis can allow you to start researching ADHD-specific strategies for coping. And this can be really helpful with or without a formal diagnosis. When it comes to formal diagnoses, oftentimes that can lead to medical treatment, but ADHD management is not simply about medication. It's not simply about getting the right medication and everything is a cure, right? Truly managing ADHD is actually more of a holistic experience. One of the phrases that gets thrown around a lot is pills don't build skills. So even after you get a formal diagnosis, and if you choose to get medication, there are still many aspects of ADHD that need to be managed in different ways. And self-diagnosing can mean that you can start to get these other strategies, these other management tools for yourself in order to get through the challenges that you're facing that won't be impacted with simply getting some medication. Self-diagnosing can make you more inclined to seek support from ADHD communities, which can provide a lot of emotional relief and practical advice. There's a lot of good ADHD communities out there helping support each other, helping figure out ways through the challenges that you have, and self-diagnosing can start you on that path a lot earlier than it would do compared to waiting for a formal diagnosis. If you're self-diagnosing with ADHD, it means that you can immediately jump in and start to go, okay, what can I do to start getting through these challenges? Rather than waiting for a formal diagnosis and then implementing strategies once you have the official confirmation. Self-diagnosis can also bring a lot of self-compassion. Knowing that your struggles may be related to ADHD can reduce those feelings of inadequacy or laziness, that, those labels that are given to us by other people or sometimes by ourselves. Self-diagnosing can help you to validate your experiences and help you give yourself that self-compassion. Self-diagnosing can increase your self-awareness. It can lead to a greater introspection and understanding your own habits and behaviors. It's good to have a label for your experiences and what you feel, and having that label of ADHD and self-diagnosing can help you start to develop that self-awareness and understand your brain better. So if you're a fellow ADHDer and you want to learn more about how your brain works and how to get shit done, then I invite you to subscribe to the channel and like this video if you want to see more ADHD content. So thank you for watching, and with that being said, I will see you in the next video.